attorney. And when, I will tell you this story. When I was a psychology major in college, not, more of a good time girl, and went to law school with the express intent of working in abuse and neglect.
Oh,
That was because I had worked with a bunch of kids who were the Denver Department of Social Services. So I ran a group with these kids. So that was my motivation. I realized very quickly that it involved being in a prosecutor's office. And that did not gel with my good time girl. So it was kind of a dilemma. So I kind of gave up on that, but I would love to talk to you about how you married that without being in the prosecutor's office.
yes, right? That was my goal, just to not be in a prosecutor's office.
Yeah. For whatever reason, yeah, didn't want to go there. Yeah.
I'm there with you. I completely understand that. And I, had a similar experience where I was actually an undergraduate intern in the DA's office. And I remember calling my mom and I was like, what is this? I was like, victims don't get justice through this system. Like, this system is broken. And I was like a child. I was like this young kid in college, and I could see then how broken the system was. And I was like, how do I help people, but not be part of a system that is continuing to perpetrate harms against other people? Like,
that's a great place for us to start. I can see Brandy going. All right, we're recording, but we're not really starting.
We're not live yet.
Let's go.
I think we had 1 or 2 people register, so I just want to make sure we start on time in case they are here.
Okay.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark. We have Stacy Malone, the Executive Director of the Victim Rights Law Center, with us today to talk to us about sexual assault awareness. For some background, Stacy joined the Victim Rights Law Center in 2004 as a volunteer attorney, where she provided legal services to sexual assault survivors on employment, safety, privacy, and criminal justice advocacy. And after serving for 5 years on their board of directors in various leadership positions, she joined the organization's leadership team as the co-administrator and was subsequently appointed executive director in 2010. So with that, let's get started. Stacy and Diana, we will open the floor for questions with about 5 minutes left in the webinar, and I will turn it over to you two.
Thank you, Brandy.
Thanks,
Welcome,
Brandy.
Stacy. It is great to have you on the show. Stacy and I were talking in the pre-show that we both have legal backgrounds, but our goal of supporting victims took very, very different paths. So tell us a little bit about how, not just the professional piece, about how you wound up where you did, but what motivated you? What inspired you?
Yeah, and that's such a great question. And I always expect for folks to be so curious about that. So whenever they do, I'm like, oh yes, let's talk about how we inspire other people and how to do such great work working with survivors of sexual violence. And I grew up in a neighborhood, in a public housing neighborhood, and my mom raised my brother and I on welfare benefits. And that was our life. Like, we lived there my entire childhood from second grade until I went to college. And I did see a lot of violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, gun violence. There was just a lot of violence in our community. But with that said, there was this incredible network of support that I saw, especially amongst the women. The single moms were just like, they were complete badasses. They were raising kids. They were figuring out how to hustle and work. They were there for each other. And I was so inspired by their strength. And I didn't kind of quite understand that as I was going on my journey, how those women were elevating each other. And in a sense, they were also elevating kind of my aspirations to be a lawyer, to be an advocate for folks that needed help. And it was life-changing. And so folks always like, do you wish you could go back and change anything? I'm like, are you kidding me? I learned so much from these incredible women. Like, what a gift they gave me. And so it's such an honor. I'm still connected to so many folks in my old neighborhood. and they are always giving me the like little rallying cheers, like, go get them. And I appreciate that so much. So I would say it's really my passion for helping survivors is really rooted in kind of that personal experience of where I grew up, the things that I saw, the things that I heard, and just knowing that we need to have a safer world for people and trying to find my own path and how to get there.
Excellent. And it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Is that right?
April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month.
Okay.
Yeah, so we bring,
yeah.
So it's a great time to talk about the issue.
Well, particularly because I want to ask you a question. My first nervousness as a young woman occurred on vacation. Talk about vacation and sexual assault awareness.
Yeah, we certainly see that happen a lot. I think that when folks are on vacation, right, they're more relaxed, their barriers and their walls come down a little bit. There's use of alcohol or drugs, or they're willing to experiment with sex for the first time, or they're meeting people they've never met before and their community isn't as tight. And so we see it a lot, especially for, college students going on spring break, right? Kids taking like long weekends with friends for the first time and taking trips. And then even families, we see a lot of child sex abuse that happens when family goes on vacation and their children are exposed to maybe a camp or a new community, and they just don't have the same kind of network or resources, or they're just not looking for those signs or may not know what signs to look for in the first place. So vacation seems like a time to be able to kick back, relax, and have fun. But I think especially as parents and as individuals, we need to always be paying attention to the world around us, and be mindful of that. That's a great question.
So let's pretend you're a mom and you're taking your kids on vacation and they're of teenage years, say 13 through 17. By 18, they should know. Let's assume they do. What are the few pieces of advice you give?
So I always say to parents, start talking about sex earlier, right? My work is not about sex. My work is about power dynamics, right? I talk about violence. But kids need to know what appropriate touching is, need to know what consent is. Like, they need to have those basics kind of in their tool belt, or then they may not even know when something isn't okay because they don't know what is okay. And so my first piece of advice to parents is always like, talk about sex early. There are so many great books out there and movies and videos where you can have these conversations at different ages. And it's not a one-stop shop talking about like the birds and the bees, right? It's about an ongoing conversation that you have with your children, so they understand kind of their body, their boundaries, and what consent is and what's acceptable. So I would say start talking with kids first. Then I am a believer in, allowing teenagers to have that space, right, to grow and to learn and become those adults. So I'm not like a micromanager of children. And I do think that if we raise them with the right information, then they feel their gut, right? And talking to kids about what do you feel in your gut? Like, you're smart. What does it feel? And if it doesn't feel okay, I need you to come to me, right? And then I won't be mad at you. I won't be upset with you. Like, I'm going to want to know, like, I'm here for you. So I always say, talk about it early and then have kids understand what their gut is. And then make sure that there really is an open line of communication with their children, so that if something strange happens or uncomfortable happens, that they'll come to you and know that you won't be angry with them.
That's great. Because what we do know is the percentages. Let's talk a little bit about statistics with sexual assault, both heterosexual and LGBTQ.
Yeah, I mean, I think that folks are always really surprised to think that sexual violence really does happen to everyone and anyone. And it's one of the biggest differences between domestic violence and sexual violence. With domestic violence, right, with an intimate partner, we oftentimes see in an older category of folks, it's more like 30s, 40s, 50s, but sexual violence actually disproportionately impacts younger people. So 12 to 24 is the age range when a majority of sexual violence happens. And we also know that if someone is sexually assaulted, and especially that 12 to 24 age range, they're actually more likely, if they don't get resources then, to be re-victimized later on in life, right? I mean, you know this from your background. It's like, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that can happen, but it does. It happens frequently. So we see a lot of sexual violence with child sex abuse in neighborhoods and in schools. We see a lot of campus sexual assault. Folks going to school for the first time. You probably have heard the red zone, where that first year in college before Thanksgiving tends to be a very high target time for individuals to be sexually assaulted, and it's real. And then, we are in June, which is Pride Month, which is so wonderful. It really encourages folks to have the conversation about our LGBTQAI plus community members, and sexual violence really, really, really impacts those individuals. 66% of trans individuals have experienced sexual violence, 66%, right? And then if you look at the intersection with race, 87% of Black and trans women have experienced at least more than one form of violence. I mean, that intersection of gender identity, of race, really can put folks in a spot where their rates of sexual violence are even higher. And then they may have fear of coming forward for resources because they're worried about, being outed without consent, fear of losing their community, maybe discrimination by a service provider, a lack of resources, or, what I always worry about, I think for folks, is that this fear of being defined by their sexual orientation or by their gender identity, and folks not seeing them as that whole person. And so through our work, whether a survivor is someone who is young, someone who identifies as male, someone who is LGBTQ, we're looking at the whole person and what is it they need to be able to heal and rebuild their lives.
So you use the word survivor, and yet your organization's victims' rights. Do you think about the messaging when you talk those two words?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our clients say when they come to our organization, they identify as a victim of a crime. So they have been sexually assaulted, they have been raped, and they are now trying to figure out what life looks like next. And then we hear from the folks that have our access to our services, and they have access to a free lawyer, that they then become a survivor through that process, which how incredibly powerful. I have this, I wish I had it with me, but I have this drawing that one of our young clients made and left in the office, and it was a butterfly. And it feels so cliche to say that it's like a transformation like a butterfly, because of course everyone's journey is so different and so difficult. But there is something about, I'm a survivor myself, that journey of experiencing sexual violence and feeling like that victim, like you didn't do anything to deserve this. And then what your journey looks like afterwards to then survive that and to thrive through that. It's real.
And I do think you make a really important point for those people who haven't experienced a sexual assault or haven't experienced some kind of abuse that involved sexuality or sex. There is a getting past it for many. There is a way of, not that you don't have that moment, but there is a moment to survive, to thrive.
And yeah, I think we kind of absorb it, right? It becomes part of who we are. And then we look at the world through a totally different lens. And we need to figure out how that lens fits us, what that looks like, and then how we experience life going forward. But it's hard.
It is hard. And to thriving in our culture, regardless of what your orientation, gender, or religion or anything in our culture, is difficult.
Absolutely. And I do think it's really important for us to talk about the different populations, right, that experience at higher rates. I feel like how lucky am I to have this white privilege to say, around Juneteenth, what an incredible celebration. But we need to talk about how sexual violence disproportionately impacts Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, LGBTQ+. Like, those stats are real. And so pretending as if the intersections of these different identities don't change the experience for that individual, it's a disservice to folks that are having these experiences.
So when they look at statistics, like 1 in 4 women are sexually assaulted by the time, or abused by the time they're 18 or 20 or something like that.
Yes.
1 in 4. The rates are higher for Black women. Is that right?
Absolutely. 100% they are. And those stats are real. I mean, I can tell you, I have people over the years say to me like, well, I feel like no one that I know has ever been sexually assaulted. I'm like, then they're not telling you, and you should wonder why. They're not sure, right? They're not sharing their experiences or asking you for help or making that connection to you. Because I can tell you that, we have had college campuses where we've had 20 victims to 1 perpetrator. So when I hear like that stat in 1 in 4, I'm like, yeah, it's real. It's real. Look around the room and understand that is something that can bind us, and that there's no shame around that. Like, we didn't ask for this or do this. And how do we not come together to say it's not okay and to make real change in the world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, how do we? How do we, I think it starts with language. I've been starting to examine, I'm old,
Mm.
Stacy. So words that were okay 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, hot,
Yeah.
sexy, all of those to define somebody, objectifying them,
Yes.
that's changing because those things made assault somewhat okay.
Definitely. I'm a big fan in the language that we use and how it just evolves over time, and that we need to be okay with language evolving. I have heard folks be like, oh, this whole gender identity, like she, her, like, I don't understand that. I'm like, well, you need to, like, it's really important because these are people, these are humans. And if you're uncomfortable, like, you need to you need to work past your discomfort, because we're talking about people who are your neighbors and your friends and your kids, and like, get it together. So I am also a fan of language and acknowledging that we make mistakes, right? And that we own those mistakes and we do better.
That's right. I live in rural Vermont, Stacy. You did not necessarily know that, but
I'm in Vermont right now.
You are where?
I am right near Woodstock, Vermont.
Okay, we'll talk after the show. Anyway, it is a different culture in terms of it is almost all white. We do not have people of color around, and yet our sexual assault rates are very high.
Yes.
Because
Yeah, I will say two things about that. One is that how inspired I was, driving through a community that is predominantly white and seeing Black Lives Matter rallies, right? I was like, shit, yeah, you get that. Like, I was just so, I just got goosebumps just thinking about, having folks who are white step up and be like, it's our responsibility to make change. Let's do this. And then I will say around sexual violence in rural communities, we see that a lot. When folks are isolated, it is easier to perpetrate sexual violence and other forms of abuse. And then it's harder to get access to resources because there's just so much less in your community. And so it's not surprising to me that we see that kind of correlation with rural communities, alcohol and drug abuse, mental health concerns, all intertwined with sexual violence.
And do you actually report on the guy who you have known who lives 1/4 of a mile down the road from you, and there's nobody else in between you and them?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, that is how I got into this work. And, I talked a little bit in the pre-show, but the criminal justice system just does not provide the answers that survivors need. It just doesn't,
Let's talk
right?
about that a little
Right.
bit. Yeah.
And so when you think about that individual who is now living in this small insular community with the person that assaulted them, we're going to ask them to call the police and start this potentially criminal justice process that may not then even result in a conviction and incarceration. Like, why would you do that to yourself? Now, listen, the criminal justice system, some folks, believe in it, find it helpful, find justice through it. I just, in my, dozen years of working with sexual assault survivors, have not always seen that come to fruition. And that is how I got into the civil space. So the Victim Rights Law Center provides free civil legal services to survivors of sexual violence. And what that means is that if a survivor doesn't want to call the police, feels like they can't, doesn't want to engage in that criminal justice process, or even if they do, they still have so many other rights, right? They're worried about their privacy. Like, I don't want everyone in my community to know that I was raped. I am worried about my safety because if I was raped once, is it going to happen again? What will that look like for me? And then maybe it was someone maybe it was someone at my job. Now I need to navigate my employment. It was someone in my apartment complex. I need to navigate my housing. I've an undocumented status. I need help with my immigration and legal remedies. I'm on campus. I don't want to leave school, right? How do I stay out in school? So there are so many different legal avenues a survivor can access to stabilize their lives following sexual violence.
So what is the first thing you would advocate for a young woman, young man?
I would say privacy. I would say folks of every gender identity who experience sexual violence, privacy is the #1 concern they have, because sexual violence is such a violation, right, of your body, your mind, and your soul. And your first thought is, I don't want to tell anyone. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want people to know. But then how do I get help if I can't talk about it? And so helping folks kind of navigate what privacy can look like for them so that they can get the help that they need, but maybe not have to share their experience with everyone. So privacy is always the most important.
So that's the first thing you would say. What level of privacy would you like to maintain around this?
Right. Who knows? Who do you want to know? Who do you not want to know? And what does that mean for you? And then safety. Like, are you safe? What does safety look like for you? Do you need help figuring out how to get to school, how to get to work, how to like, what makes you feel safe? And more importantly, what makes you feel unsafe? And how do I help you get a restraining order? Do I help you put together some sort of a schedule where we figure out how you get to places? What does safety mean for you?
Right. And do you think about restorative meetings or things like that? Talk a little bit about restorative justice in the sexual assault realm.
Yeah, restorative justice has had quite a surge over the past several years. Where we have seen it the most is actually in the K through 12 and campus spaces. A lot of schools, really believe in trying to bring all parties to the table. And for me, I struggle a little bit with it, right? Like I think that sometimes restorative justice can be really meaningful for survivors who may be okay having that, being able to be in the same room with the perpetrator, being able to have and engage in those conversations and setting it some guide rules around how to do that. But some survivors are not going to do it. And I'm a big fan in giving survivors option. And that really is kind of our legal practice is you tell me kind of what you need, and then I can help you work out how we get there.
So I'm thinking about a lot of our listeners and watchers are therapists. And so I imagine that every one of us who treats people for any diagnosis, frankly, is treating somebody who has a high percentage likelihood of having had a sexual assault, whether they have schizophrenia, whether they have bipolar disorder, whether they have substance use disorders. The percentages are astronomically high and in fact, almost unanimous, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yet folks with mental health concerns, folks with drug or alcohol addiction, they're oftentimes targeted for sexual violence, or they may then have some of these because they were sexually assaulted, right? I can even tell you how many survivors I've worked with who have then developed drug addiction, alcohol addiction, eating disorders, cutting, self-harming. So there is, again, another very significant intersection between those concerns and sexual violence. And I think what I would say to those therapists is, to listen, ask the right questions, know that a survivor may not tell you at the beginning, it may come out at some point, and be sure to offer them services. Not all therapists are trained on how to work with someone who's experienced significant trauma. And if that is not you, make sure that individual gets the real services that they need. And that's okay. It's okay not to be an expert in everything.
Mm-hmm. So when you say ask the right questions, give us 3.
Yeah. So I think when someone, I think for a therapist, hearing from someone that they were raped or sexually assaulted, hearing that is being kind and asking those questions, right? Thinking about their body language, how they receive that. I have seen so many folks hearing it for the first time and then like they sit back in their chair, right? Exactly. And it's like, no, like with anything, you want to listen and you want to hear and you want to ask those questions like, oh, that's, thank you for sharing that with me. Do you want to talk more about that now? Or would you like to think about that and maybe talk about that with me in a different session? Or if there are other services or other things connected to that, let me know and I'm happy to help you explore that. And I think sometimes therapists either diving in hardcore and they want to know every single dirty, or it makes them uncomfortable because they're thinking of sexual violence and they back away from it.
Right. I was at one point ran a group with young women and asked how many of these young women, it was in a recovery program, how many of these young women had been sexually assaulted, and every single one of them raised their hand.
Yeah. That's why when people tell me that they don't know someone who's experienced sexual violence, I'm like, I don't know where you live, but it is in a world that doesn't actually exist. Like it just, it doesn't. And I'm so not surprised, especially, we know sexual violence impacts folks of all gender identities, but definitely girls, that 12 to 24 age range. It's a real thing. And I'll say too, I think that the statistics for boys, for folks who identify as male at a young age are very low. And I think there's a lot caught up around masculinity and that this can't happen to them. So I don't think we even know the true statistics around so many of these acts of violence.
I think reporting by men is really low.
Yes.
I think it really creates a damage that is very different than even for young women.
It's true.
I think so too. So what else would I want to know? Tell me about a male, female, trans, anybody who came in to see you or you were exposed to, you heard their story and where they are today, that is in such a different place.
Yeah, I will tell you about the first pro bono client I ever had, because it was just so life-changing, I think, for both of us. So I was probably in my late 20s at the time, and I was volunteering with the VRLC, and I took my first volunteer case, and I was an employment attorney, so I was bringing those expertise to the case. And she was a young woman just about my age that was working, and she had taken a day off from work, and her supervisor knew that she had the day off from work, and he came to her house and he assaulted her. And it was still to this day one of the hardest factual details of a case I have ever heard. And I'm just sitting across from this young woman being like, she could be any one of my girlfriends, like any one of them. And her struggle was so real, and she had a hard time telling her family. She had a hard time telling her friends. And it was a devastating, life-changing experience for her. And at the Victim Rights Law Center, we were able to help her get a restraining order, to do protect her privacy, to help her do safety planning, and kind of think about what life would be like. We helped negotiate her out of her lease so she could break the lease in her apartment and move someplace else where she wasn't assaulted. We helped her negotiate out of her employment contract. So there were all these different legal needs that she needed that the criminal justice system wasn't intended to help with, but civil lawyers were. And that was back in 2004. The VRLC was only around for 1 year, and we're the first organization in the country to provide free legal services for sexual assault survivors. And now today, I haven't heard from her in a couple of years, but the last time, I'll tell you the two moments that stick with me. One is after all of her work was done with the organization, and she didn't need our services anymore, she knitted 2 pairs of mittens, 1 pair of mittens for me and 1 pair of mittens for another attorney that I was working with. And she is a very small woman, and the mittens come up to me like here, they cover like my fingers. And I still have them all these years later, and every year when we pull down the mittens and gloves, they inevitably fall down, and my husband's like, those mittens again. I'm like, those mittens will always be in my life. Always in my life. And I also got a note from her years later that she had moved to a different state, was married, and had her first child. And I could not have predicted that. I did not know at the beginning. Honestly, I didn't know if she would survive, right? Like with all of us, like I think life is so fragile. We don't know how we're going to navigate it, especially once we've experienced violence and we're dealing with that trauma every day.
So we are both fragile and amazingly resilient.
We are so resilient. We are. And it's hard to remember that sometimes when you're in the depth. And I think that that's one of the powerful things of having a lawyer like someone at the VRLC, is that they are able to help you elevate your voice and to be heard. And they are able to stand by you and tell you that they believe you and help support you through that. And, attorneys have these special skills, and to be able to weave a very creative support system underneath a survivor, I think really can help the healing process and help folks, kind of define what life looks like.
Excellent. I think we're going to leave it just like that. I think we have hit our times. Brandy, do we have questions?
We do not have any questions from the audience, but I would love to ask a question.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about victims' rights and survivors' rights, and making sure that they feel safe and comfortable moving forward in their life. Is there ever a point that at the same time that you are helping the survivor feel comfortable in their day-to-day, that you are also seeking legal action against the person who harmed them or assaulted them?
Yeah, that is such a fantastic question. I will say that regardless of our legal services, we are so focused on that whole person. So understanding what that is that they do need for safety day to day is the #1 priority. And, many organizations do what we call safety planning. And we say safety planning is is constant, right? Every time we speak to a survivor, we want to know, are they safe? Are they okay? Is there anything that they need, any adjustments that maybe they need? Our civil legal services, we cannot sue a perpetrator for damages. However, we do work with a lot of wonderful lawyers that we work with in partnership that sue perpetrators for damages. Those are very, very, very hard cases to win, but we have seen that happen on the occasion. And then the other avenue is the criminal justice system. About 40% of our cases have a companion criminal case. So that means that someone has reported to law enforcement, someone's being prosecuted, and that case is continuing. And how we support someone in that system is through some criminal justice advocacy. So we're happy to talk to the police with them. The prosecutor gets status on what's happening with their cases. And most importantly, especially in Massachusetts, there is a moment where defense counsel always requests the victim's medical, mental health, and education records. So if they were raped when they were 40, that defense counsel wants the records when they talked to a therapist when they were 12 and why they were cutting. And so part of our job is, again, that privacy. What is it the survivor wants to protect? So that way they are keeping, you know, their personal stuff personal. And that's kind of how we support them. And one of the ways we support them through the criminal process as well.
That's great. So they're not alone in this. Once
They're not
they make
alone.
that call to you, they are no longer alone.
They are no longer alone.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today, Stacy. What a pleasure. Appreciate it. I wish you enormous luck on all of that you do out there and the good you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.